Welcome back to my channel, sports fans. Okay, let's get into this one right here. We're going to show you today that the 90s era of basketball was the greatest era of all times. Okay, and before I get started, just some notable names that's not going to be in here that came at the end of the 90s that isn't going to make the cut. Kobe Bryant, Steve Nash, and I want to say Ben Wallace and Allen Iverson. Why I say the 90s was the greatest NBA era of all time is because of this. I'm not just talking about the players. I'm talking about the style of play. In the 80s, they didn't shoot too many threes. Okay? They didn't shoot too many threes. So it wasn't an all-around game like the 90s. And we'll talk about that in a minute. The 2000s, all the great centers were dying out and getting old. We know Shaq was the last great center in the 2000s, right? Yes, they shot the three a little bit more. But I'm talking about as far as positional play. And I think the power forward, to me, was dying out too. Yes, you had Tim Duncan. You had Kevin Garnett. But I don't think Kevin Garnett was as good as Charles Barkley or Karl Malone. So that power forward was kind of dying out to me. And why I say the 90s in general was a great era to be around as far as pop culture. And when I talk about pop culture, I'm talking about music, movies, fashion, sports. And I'm not trying to say that was the greatest decade or era as far as pop culture, because I think the 80s was the greatest. In the 90s, the 80s was a stepping stone for the 90s. The 90s carried on what the 80s did, which the 80s was the greatest era of all time. As far as music, movies, sitcoms, I would say sports and fashion, if I didn't say that. And why I say the 80s was the greatest era of all time as far as pop culture is because the originality in sitcoms, movies, music, fashion, and somewhat sports. Okay? And I think that the 90s carried on that legacy. So as far as the 90s basketball, NBA being the greatest of all time, I'm talking about they were just better, well-rounded. They shot the three. They had great post play, paint play. And the stretch bigs could shoot the ball from the mid-range. And they were good at shooting mid-range. It was an all-around game, unlike today. So when we look at this, let's look at some great players that played back then. We're going to do 93 All-Star game and the 96, because I think 93 is like, those great players came out in the 80s, about the late 80s, and they pretty much made the 90s what it was. And we're going to go to the 96 All-Star game and look at these players. And a lot of these players, they came in at the beginning of the 90s. And this is what made the 90s the most balanced era of all time. So the starters and reserves for the East, you have Isaiah Thomas, which I thought you guys said he was old and he was injured and they were no good no more. He was still making all-star teams up until 93. One of the greatest guards of all time. Some say top or point guard, top two, top three. Michael Jordan. No need to discuss that. We're looking at the starters right now. The greatest player of all time. Scottie Pippen. Top three, top five, small forward of all time. Larry Johnson. Power forward. He got hurt. This guy was a beast. Or he would have made the Hall of Fame. Shaq. One of the most dominant players of all time. We already know about Shaq. So let's go to the reserves right here. We have Brad Daugherty. Maybe a Hall of Famer if he would have never got hurt. Joe Dumars. Hall of Famer, back-to-back NBA champion, Finals MVP, Patrick Ewing, the softest touch of a center to me at the mid-range, around the basket. Larry Nance, another great power forward. Mark Price should be in the Hall of Fame. And you already see, 3 guys on one team made the All-Star team that year. Remember, this was the same Bulls team that was battling these guys in the late 80s, in the early 90s. In the late 80s, the Bulls wasn't even supposed to beat the Cavs. They didn't have enough manpower. They didn't have enough skills. But they overcame because of Michael Jordan, Scottie Pippen, and these guys prevailed. You got Def Left Shrimp. And you had Dominique Wilkins. Now, if you don't see some of this stuff pop up on your screen while I go, it's going to pop up. So let's go back over this real quick. Isaiah Thomas could shoot the three, shoot the mid-range. Jordan, all-around player. Pippen, great defender. Could give you 20 points per game. Great all-around player. Larry Johnson, a beast around the basket. Shaq, you know what he could do. Brad Daugherty, great low post player. Joe Dumars, great defender, great mid-range shooter. Could shoot the three at times. Patrick Ewing, like I said, another great mid-range shooter. Larry Nance, he could face up. Great paint shooter. Mark Price, shoot the hell out of the three. Great free throw shooter. Great mid-range shooter. Great floor general. Def Left Shrimp, good three-point shooter. Great mid-range shooter. Drive the basket. And did I miss Dominique Wilkins? I think I did. Dominique Wilkins, average at 3. Good mid-range shooter. Could give you 30, 40, 50 a game. Like it was nothing. So let's now go to the West in 1993. You got John Stockton. You already know about him. Great floor general. He could hit the three too, whenever needed. Good mid-range shooter. What do you say? Top 3 point guard of all time? Clyde Drexler. Good mid-range shooter. Good defender. I wouldn't say he was a great defender. Great rebounder. Charles Barkley, great rebounder. Great scorer. Good defender at times. Karl Malone. Good defender. Second power forward of all time. And I think Charles Barkley, top 5. And then you had David Robinson. These are your starters. For the reserves, Sean Elliott. Good mid-range shooter. Good free throw shooter. Average on defense. Tim Hardaway. Good three-point shooter. Great mid-range shooter. Good defensive player on the perimeter. Hall of Famer. Shawn Kemp. Should be a Hall of Famer. Average defender. Could be good at times. Great scorer around the paint. Could shoot the mid-range. Could post up. Dan Marley. Good mid-range shooter. Good defender. Danny Manning. Good three-point shooter. Good mid-range shooter. Could be good at defense at times. Hakeem Olajuwon. Wow, on the reserve. This thing was stacked. We already know about Hakeem. Maybe the best two-way center of all time. Terry Porter. Good three-point shooter. Good mid-range shooter. Average on defense. Mitch Richmond. Good three-point shooter. Great mid-range shooter. I think about average on defense. And Chris Mullin. Average on defense. Great three-point shooter. Great mid-range shooter. And great free throw shooter. These are great players. This is why the 90s was the greatest of all time to me. 93 is, I think, when the NBA was at its peak of its powers. It's too bad Larry Bird couldn't play until 93 because he was injured, or he would have kept making all-star teams. I think, did he make, I think he made the all-star team until like 92 or something like that. And then he had to bow out. He had to bow out. So we go to 1996. Penny Hardaway. Wow. If this guy would have never got hurt, what are we talking about? Maybe a top 10 guard of all time. One of the most versatile guards of all time. Penny Hardaway. At that time, I would say he was about average on defense. He wasn't bad. He was an average to good mid-range shooter. Average to good three-point shooter. But his game was going to be Magic Johnson-esque. Michael Jordan, we don't need to say too much about that. Scottie Pippen, we went over that. Grant Hill. Maybe a step ahead of Penny Hardaway. Because he could do everything. There's nothing this man could not do. Nothing. Even a three. He could shoot the three. He didn't shoot it at a high clip, but he could give you the three too. Shaq. We already went over Shaq. Those are the starters. So let's get into the reserves. Vin Baker. Average defender. See, when I say average defender back then, I'm still talking good. I'm not trying to say they were bad defenders. Average will get you a starting position. Because in the 90s, you was not starting if you couldn't play defense. This is why Craig Hodges, Steve Kerr, people like that couldn't start because they couldn't play defense. It had nothing to do with the offensive game. You had to at least be an average defender. So Vin Baker, shoot the three, shoot the mid-range, and he can slash to the basket. Terrell Brandon, great mid-range shooter, good free throw shooter, and good three-point shooter. Average on defense, which means you can start. Patrick Ewing, we already talked about him. He's an all-around guy. All around great. And guess what? He's a reserve. Stacked. Juwan Howard. I would say he was a good defender. He couldn't shoot the three. He could get you some buckets around the basket consistently. He didn't make too many All-Star games. Reggie Miller, we already know. Great mid-range, great three-point shooter, great free throw shooter. He was average on defense. Alonzo Mourning. Great defender. Didn't shoot the three. I wouldn't say he was great at mid-range, but he could face up. Glenn Rice. No, average defender. Great mid-range shooter. And he was a great three-point shooter. So, before we go into the West in 96, and again, like I chose 96 over 97 and 98, is because I think that was a better time in 96 than 97, 98. Because I think a lot of those guys in like 97, 98, you know, the Ben Wallaces, the Steve Nashes, and Kobe Bryants, and who else? I can't remember the rest of them that came into the late 90s. But those are more 2000 guys. So I'm going to just leave that for their era. So when we go to the West, Jason Kidd in 96. Huh? What couldn't this guy do? If I'm not mistaken, Jason Kidd came in, when did he come in? 95? No, I think he came in 92. It was the early 90s, 94. So to me, he makes the cut. Good free throw shooter. Good defender. Great rebounder. Great passer. I would say he was average at mid-range. And at this point, he was average at 3. He ended up being good to me at 3 in the 2000s. So you got Clyde Drexler. We already know about Clyde Drexler. Charles Barkley. We know about Charles Barkley. Sean Kemp. We talked about Sean Kemp. Should be in the Hall of Fame. You got Akeem Olajuwon. We talked about him. And when we go into the reserves, here we go with Sean Elliott again. If you think David Robinson didn't have any help, think again. That West was just stacked. He had as many all-star teammates as Michael Jordan. Michael Jordan had 1. Robinson had 1. And then you got Karl Malone. He's on the reserves. Stacked. Dikembe Mutombo. One of the greatest two-way players of all time. Average offensive game. Gary Payton. The glove. To me, he was a good mid-range shooter and an average three-point shooter, but he can get you threes whenever you needed it in big moments. I've seen it a million times. Great defensive player. We know about Gary Payton. Mitch Richmond, we talked about him. David Robinson, we talked about him. Was a good mid-range shooter to me. He wasn't great, but he could face up, and he killed you in the paint. One of the great defenders of all time, in my opinion. And one of the great scorers at the center position. And then we have John Stockton again. So what I'm saying is, the 90s, to me, was the greatest era of all time as far as the NBA. Good three-point shooters. Great mid-range shooters. Because the majority of the shots came from mid-range. That's why you don't see the guys today shoot the mid-range. Why? Because you got to have touch. You got to have touch all around the perimeter. I'm talking about inside the 3 and outside the paint. And to me, that's why Michael Jordan, to me, is the greatest shooter of all time. Nobody killed that mid-range like Michael Jordan. And at a difficult rate. Pump fakes, fallaways, fadeaways. Just not facing up like a Kevin Durant. Kevin Durant is a great mid-range shooter. But he played in the no-touch era. And to me, I don't think his shots are difficult. Michael Jordan took shots that you would never take. You're not supposed to take. Or you would get in trouble. Yes, Steph Curry is a great shooter. But I don't think he had the type of defense that Michael Jordan had. He didn't have to go against great power forwards, great centers, and lockdown defense that Michael Jordan had to go against. So to me, I don't think Steph Curry is a better shooter than Michael Jordan. Yes, from the 3, I would say, but all around game, no way. No way. The degree of difficulty. Steph Curry will be, in the 90s, I want to think of the guy who was a great three-point shooter. Maybe a Reggie Miller. Right? Reggie Miller used to come off those screens. 1, 2, 3. Shoot that ball, and he still had a hand in his grill. That's how tough the defense was back then. So that's all Curry would be to me, was he'd be a Reggie Miller, which isn't bad. Reggie Miller, all-time great. But the defense was just different in the 90s. And again, I'm going to tell you, I don't think they're better shooters today because they don't shoot the mid-range. And the game is just wide open. 4 guys sitting at the three-point line. 1 guy with the ball decides to drive. And then one of the three-point defenders comes off of his guy to get the guy that's driving. So now you got 2 guys on the guy that's driving. And then the guy that's driving, he said, well, am I going to keep driving or kick it out to the open three-point guy? So if he kicks it out to the open three-point guy, now another three-point defender is coming off his guy to get the guy that's wide open with the ball now. Now the three-point defender says, well, am I going to shoot this? Or am I going to pass it to another open three-point guy? And it just goes on and on and on all game on both sides of the court. This is the same game, same play by both teams. And I keep trying to tell you, these ain't real coaches. What are they running? The Princeton, the triangle? What offense are they running? They're running the same offense, both teams. I've told you in the 90s, it wouldn't work. Not because they wasn't great shooters. It's because when I told you that guy that's driving to the basket, you're not going to have a guy come off of his guy at the perimeter to get the guy that's driving, because the guys in the 90s can hold their own and they don't play in the no-touch era. That's why today you see a guy come and help the guy that's driving because they're playing in the no-touch era. He can just go right past his defender because you can't hand check, you can't do nothing. Arm bar, you can't do nothing. In the 90s, this style of play today would not work because these guys back then could handle their own. Like I said, you couldn't be on the court back then if you couldn't play defense. If you couldn't play at least average defense. Defense came first. That's why the teams that the majority I knew in the 80s and 90s that won the championship was all about defense first. That's why if you wasn't an average defender, you couldn't be on the floor. It didn't matter how good your offensive game was, Steve Kerr or Craig Hodges or these type of guys, you couldn't be on the floor. Now, they could be on the floor in this era because there's no defense. So you guys tell me what you think. I think the 90s was the best because it was more balanced. Offense, defense, mid-range, paint game, and they shot the 3. Not at a high clip.